my presentation, my presentation is about the dynamic purchasing system. And I hope in the next 20 minutes, I can convince you that it's a win-win solution for both buyers and suppliers. A little bit about public procurement services. You can check out our new website. We have 6 to 7 very experienced procurement advisors available. Most of them are retired public servants with procurement expertise. We do everything from training to consulting, end-to-end management, but all details are available on our website. In presenting on the DPS, I think it's very important at the outset that I reference the very, very helpful OGP guidance document. If you're considering a DPS in the light of this presentation, you absolutely should read through the detail of the OGP guidance. It is very helpful. I will cover some of the elements and maybe point out where the guidance could perhaps be complemented in due course. A dynamic purchasing system can be used for works, supplies, and services. So all categories of that are procured typically, where relevant, a dynamic purchasing system can be used. So typically, if you're using a dynamic purchasing system, it's like a pre-qualification. You publish a pre-qualification document, you pre-qualify suppliers, you ask them to submit an application response document, you give them 30 days. Any supplier that doesn't meet your requirements has the option of reapplying, which is quite unusual and one of the unique features of the dynamic purchasing system. You typically will assess applications fairly quickly or reapplications within 10 days. And like a framework, once you have your DPS members ready, you run mini competitions in the same way as you would with a framework, but there are subtle differences that I'll talk about. When you want to run a mini competition, everyone who qualifies for either the DPS or if there's a lot for that particular lot must be invited to respond to the tender documents. The tender documents will typically include your product or your specifications, your technical specifications or requirement, and they're typically put into a mini competition format. You're allowed to set a term of contract that suits you. Unlike a framework, which is limited to 4 years, a DPS contract could be 5, 6, 7, 8, even 9, 10 years. And that's one of the attractions of a DPS. You don't have to re-advertise every 2 to 3 years in a framework arrangement. And unlike a framework, suppliers can join at any time. So you can actually go to suppliers and say, listen, we'd like you to join this DPS. We know you can do X and Y, and go through the pre-qualification, which is a huge attraction compared to a framework. Because as you know, once a supplier gets on a panel in the framework, it is only those suppliers who are locked in to bid for the next 4 years. And quite frequently, when they're on those panels, they decide not to bid. So the competitive element of a framework can in fact be affected. Any number of suppliers can join. There's no limit, unlike a framework where you might say 4 or 5. So any supplier that meets your minimum requirements will join the framework or will join the DPS. It really suits certain types of procurement. It does not suit high value, high risk, bespoke requirements. This is best and only should be used for low value, routine, less risky arrangements. Certainly anything in between should be an open procedure perhaps. So this is a very particular form of procurement that suits repetitive, I could use the term, purchasing. And in pre-qualifying, suppliers do not need to submit their prices. You will only get those prices when responses come in to your mini tenders. The documentation that you would want to use is readily available. I'm going to cover that a bit later on in the presentation. You can actually seek bids through a mini competition in as less than 10 days, which is very attractive if you're looking for, say, mech-elec or trainers or whatever else you happen to be covering. So a shorter period than The 30 days that is typical in a framework or an open procedure can be used. The evaluation process is the same. You'd be familiar with evaluations either for open procedure or for frameworks, where DPS is no different. And it's really no different. It's all managed on e-tenders. So once you're familiar with e-tenders, running a DPS is not that much different. E-catalogues can be used by suppliers. I haven't seen so many incidents in Ireland, but they can be used, as can lotting, or indeed use of categories. So you can put as many or as few lots or sublots as you want into your tender documents. Now, this really suits local suppliers or regional suppliers, because you can base lots based on county or provinces or groups of counties. It is also a very competitive process, because soon enough, once the mini competition results are being rolled out and you send out the results letters, the contractors will discover their pricing point. They will discover how close they are pricing wise to their winning bidder. So you will get competitive tenders coming in, and that's already the experience from those contracting authorities that are currently using a DPS. Now, there are a couple of words of caution. Successful DPS members, they are not obliged to respond to your mini competitions. You'll probably discover that maybe 50–60% of those on the panel may respond, which would be a good outturn for most competitions in the current economic environment. Absolutely, DPSs are not suitable where bespoke supplies or services are required. As I said earlier on, you should not be using a DPS where there are operational and supply chain risks. Use it for routine, low value, repetitive requirements, of which most contracting authorities has quite a few, and most of these requirements are currently under the under €25,000 category. Be sensible about setting lots. Don't be too specific. You can set a general lot, general advices or general training, which could capture quite a bit, which you can then amplify in subsequent mini competitions. To get a successful DPS, you advertise it on e-tenders, you will get a certain response, but you can and should market the DPS to suppliers. There's no reason as to why you cannot advertise the DPS or seek one-to-one contacts and encourage suppliers to apply to the DPS, which would include perhaps incumbents or companies that you know. And the more companies that are in the DPS, the more competitive bids you get, which means better value for money. Now, you must set not only the estimated value of the DPS, say over its 10-year term, but you should also, and you are required to set the value per lot. So you just can't run a DPS without significant attention to detail, including perhaps running a business case as is appropriate. Procurement personnel are familiar enough dealing with e-tenders. There's an additional layer of training required, and that's available on the OGP guidance I mentioned earlier on. Once you issue your DPS, you cannot add other contracting authorities. You become the contracting authority unless you have named others, and you cannot change lots. So you have to be very careful in the construction of your lotting strategy. You can, and indeed should, request up-to-date supporting documents throughout the process. Particularly before the award of contract, you must look for up-to-date insurance certificates and evidence of tax clearance certificate. You can't negotiate. It's the same with frameworks or with open procedures. This is not a facility to open negotiations on any aspect. They're all set down in the contract documents. And there's no obligation on a contracting authority to advise DPS members that additional members have been added to panels, although in practice this is what happens. This is a quick graphic just to show you the timeline. So you publish a DPS on e-tenders or TED. You get the pre-qualification process sorted out. You issue DPS agreements. Then you go for individual mini competitions through a DPS tender, a request for tender. You evaluate them in the usual way. You can give people as short as 10 days to respond. They get results letters. And very interestingly, at EU level, you are not required, if the government so chose, to issue a standstill. So currently, as I understand it, there is a standstill period, but at EU level, the government has an option not to apply a standstill if that was the case. So the DPS can procure and get a contract for you at fairly short notice, far quicker than an open procedure or a framework in some circumstances. So it is attractive. Is it a win-win? There's guidance available in addition to the OGP. This is the EU guidance. It's very, very well written, as indeed is the OGP guidance, and it covers an awful lot of questions that you might typically have on your mind about the practicalities of running the DPS. So if you're seriously considering running a DPS, in addition to the OGP guidance, have a look at this guidance as well. It's, again, as I said, it's very, very easy to read and it's user-friendly. This graphic shows what numbers of DPSs are being run. In Ireland, the number is now 185. And I'll show you the statistics in a minute. But by 2020, we only had 37. So it's been a huge increase in the number of DPSs used in Ireland in the last 2 to 3 years. And at European Union level, not that many. And most of those 893, believe it or not, were in the UK. So DPS is a growing phenomenon in Ireland. And these are the statistics that were kindly given to me by the OGP. They, in turn, have 12 DPSs, and others, as I'll explain in a minute, have quite a few. The semi-state sector is quite prominent with 85, as indeed is the healthcare sector. So that number is growing all the time. And as a lot of the DPS contracts are long-term, these DPSs will be in place much longer than their equivalent frameworks. So the OGP has 12, including for procurement advisors, creative campaign services, print and design, network connectivity, electricity, vans, commercial trucks, laundry, etc., and more are planned. The HSE is using DPSs nearly as a default way to procure for an awful lot of equipment and supplies. And an awful lot of suppliers that we work with are really, really happy to see the HSE using DPSs nearly on a systematic basis. Local government has at least 9 DPSs, including SupplyGov, across a wide range of supplies, services, and works contractors. A lot of other contracting authorities, at least 18, have a huge range of DPSs. You can check out this site, Udarosna Gaeltachta, Teagasc, Beaumont Hospital, Wexford Chamber SkillNet. You can see the variety of DPSs that are being used for recruitment, for training, for second-hand vehicles, for hair and beauty products, plant hire. Quite an amount of contracting authorities are making practical use of the DPS. This is also taken from the EU guidance document. You can see you have the option of setting 1 lot or more than 100, and there's a huge variety of choice. It is really up to you to decide how many lots you wish to use. No rules to set a limit, so it's up to you to decide the correct number of lots. It's also for you to decide what is most appropriate for a DPS. And you can see from this particular chart that the DPS has been used across the European Union in practically every single procurement category. The share is growing. Works is still small, although there's no, perhaps because there's no construction works management framework guidance promoting a DPS in works, in particular for works professionals, but it's fairly evenly split between supplies and services. Another big issue that people ask about is how long should the contract be, the term of contract? Well, it's open-ended. You can set any term you want. That's what the directive states. It's not just 4 years, which is the current convention. You can have a 10-year contract, a 10-year DPS, and you can collapse the DPS at any stage as well. So it is very, very flexible. One of the reasons why contracting authorities may not want to use a DPS is that, oh, we don't have the template documents or it's too much work. Well, in reality, it's the opposite. And in the following slides, I'm going to explain why. The OGP has published template documents. They're issuing DPSs all the time, and you can top and tail these template documents, put your logo on them and use them because they've been approved by the OGP and the Chief State Solicitor's Office. So on the left side, you can see there's a request for applicants to participate, and you produce on the right side a applicant response document. The contractors or the suppliers complete the applicant response document. You then seek on the left side references confirmation from public bodies that are mentioned as the reference referees. That must be done because for due diligence purposes, you need to check that what reference sites are coming in are actually accurate and appropriate. On the right side, you'll get a letter confirming you're a member of the DPS. So all these template letters and emails are available to everyone. There's a template for the dynamic purchasing system agreement. You just need to fill out the blanks. It's not that more different than filling out a framework agreement, or indeed on the right side, a services contract. It's more or less the same for DPS as it is for an open procedure, or for a framework. So these documents, the look of them, you'll be familiar with. So there shouldn't be any hesitation in a way if a DPS is appropriate to use the available template documents. If you want to run a mini competition, you can issue a mini competition based on the documentation on the left, which is all in the public domain, or the one on the right, which is a response document, which is typically available to contractors. And using response documents, tender response documents, is, as you know, best practice. On the left, you can get your standard results letter, and on the right, you get your marks and your scores. So all of these documents and letters are available, and that makes life very easy for anyone contemplating doing a DPS. The membership of a DPS initially would be X number of companies per lot or per category, but over time it will increase, the numbers will increase. And again, I think it's best practice that if there's a significant change in the profile of companies on the panels, you should notify other panel members, as happened in this instance. Few final thoughts. There is a gap in the sense that the construction works management framework doesn't promote and doesn't say much of anything in relation to DPSs, and that's a problem, particularly for small works and particularly for the recruitment of construction professionals. The OGP guidance is excellent, but I think it would be helpful if it was amended to include the template documents that I've just referenced, and if all of these were made available in Word, hopefully editable, to contracting authorities such as yourselves who want to run DPSs. We have a new e-tenders platform coming in, so obviously it will have a particular section in managing DPSs, which we should all look forward to. Now, while there are 185 dynamic purchasing systems in Ireland, compared to other countries, including the UK, in its newly reformed procurement rules, is going down the DPS route as the default procedure, as distinct from the open procedure. The UK will now use the DPS absolutely wherever it is possible. Over time, and it's starting slowly, some of the OGP's frameworks will be replaced by DPSs, because the DPS is a much more attractive form of procurement for lower value routine purchases. It is a longer term, not just a 4-year term as with frameworks. And most importantly, suppliers can join the DPS at any stage, which can't happen in a framework. A small procedural issue, but an important issue, is in most countries, and they don't use standstill once you're having a mini competition, we have the option of waiving the provision for a standstill. Worth considering. Now, obviously, all of this is subject to the procurement personnel in contracting authorities getting a little bit of an uplift in training based on the OGP guidance, which again, I say is very, very useful. I'll leave the last word to one of our clients, Bill Lowe, who was with the Three Counties Energy Agency. His quote is very simple. "We have found the DPS fantastic, and it really has speeded up procurement and made life much easier. So far, no problems or issues with the DPS. For the Three Counties Energy Agency, the DPS has been a win-win solution. I hope it may be for some of you at the conference today." Very happy to take questions.